The Federal Vision themselves promote their theology by explaining and arguing their distinctive doctrine of the covenant. I referred earlier to the important book written by Norman Shepherd, which exposed the Federal Vision theology to all of the conservative Reformed churches in North America. That was a seminal book, a fundamental book. The title was The Call of Grace, and this was the subtitle, How the Covenant Illuminates Salvation and Evangelism. From beginning to end, Shepherd's book is an exposition and defense of his and the Federal Vision's doctrine of the covenant. Recently, a Presbyterian theologian by the name of Peter Lilback attempted to defend the theology of the Federal Vision by grounding it in John Calvin. He wrote a book entitled The Binding of God. The subtitle was Calvin's Role in the Development of Covenant Theology. Indeed, should anyone still question whether the Federal Vision is about the covenant, the critics of the Federal Vision perceive the Federal Vision as a certain definite doctrine of the covenant. Now, they never act on this perception, but they do recognize what, after all, is unmistakable. The Presbyterian theologian Guy Waters, for example, who is widely touted as one of the most important and reliable critics of the Federal Vision, titled the book in which he critiqued the Federal Vision and Covenant Theology. Waters did not, in fact, do what the title of his book promised, namely, expose and refute the covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision. Not at all, but he did at least acknowledge what the root of the Federal Vision is, a distinctive doctrine of the covenant. Because the Federal Vision is a theology of the covenant, no criticism of the Federal Vision is or can be effective that does not address the Federal Vision's doctrine of the covenant. All such criticism that ignores its doctrine of the covenant is superficial, indeed irrelevant, in fact, dangerous. The malignant tumor remains securely in the body of Reformed and Presbyterian churches. And what is the distinctive covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision? What is its supposedly new vision regarding the covenant of God in Jesus Christ? What is this covenant doctrine that manifests itself in the teaching of justification by faith and works? That manifests itself in the teaching of an election of many unto grace who nevertheless fail to be saved everlastingly. That manifests itself in the teaching of a saving grace of God that can be resisted and lost. That manifests itself in the teaching of the falling away of many into hell who once truly believed and were united to Jesus Christ. The Federal Vision's distinctive doctrine of the covenant is that the covenant is conditional. The covenant of God depends upon us humans, upon us with whom God establishes His covenant. Because the Federal Vision is especially a doctrine of the covenant with respect to the baptized babies of godly parents, the covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision is that the covenant depends upon baptized infants. There cannot be any doubt about this description of the covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision. No one can challenge this analysis. For the men of the Federal Vision themselves tell us that this is their distinctive doctrine of the covenant. Shepherd informed his interrogators in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and at Westminster Seminary that this was his doctrine of the covenant, out of which came his teaching of justification by faith and works. And he informs the world of this in his book, The Call of Grace. In that book, Shepherd explicitly denies that God's covenant with Abraham, and that was the covenant, remember, that God fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and that is now with us believers and our children. Shepherd explicitly denies that God's covenant with Abraham was unconditional. Rather, and now I quote Shepherd, conditions were indeed attached to the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham. End of quote. With reference specifically to the new covenant of God in Jesus Christ, Shepherd writes, quote, grace is not without conditions, end quote. The conditional covenant, he is saying, is the fundamental explanation of all his teachings. Justification by faith and works, in particular. Justification by works is the fruit in his theology. The root is the conditional covenant. In a book that was written not long ago by the men of the Federal Vision themselves to explain and defend their teachings, the book that has the title, The Federal Vision, the Reverend John Barrick, at that time a minister in the United Reformed Churches, wrote that, now I quote him, God truly brings those people into his covenant, into union with Christ, causes them to share in his blessings and experience his love, who nevertheless fall away and perish everlastingly in hell. End of quote. The reason, Barrick went on, is that, quote, the covenant relationship is conditional. End of quote. This doctrine of a conditional covenant, which is the root of all of the heretical teachings of the Federal Vision, is not, in fact, new with the men of the Federal Vision, as the word vision in their self-adopted name, Federal Vision, would suggest. Their covenant doctrine did not spring full-blown from the head of Norman Shepherd as, according to Greek mythology, Athena sprang full-blown out of the head of Zeus. Their doctrine of the covenant is not a doctrine of the covenant that Reformed theologians had never heard of before Shepherd, Barrick, Schlissel, and Wilson came on the scene. There is something new about the covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision. What is new about it, what is visionary about it, is its bold development of an old doctrine of the covenant. A doctrine of the covenant that has troubled the Reformed churches for a long time, going all the way back to Amyraut in the 17th century, and indeed to Arminius in the late 16th century. The conditional covenant doctrine of the Federal Vision is the doctrine of the covenant that has been taught by and is closely associated with the Dutch Reformed theologians Klaas Schilder and Benne Holwerda, taught by and associated with the Reformed churches in the Netherlands Liberated, taught by and associated with the Canadian Reformed churches and the American Reformed churches in North America, and taught by and associated with the Free Reformed churches in Australia. The men of the Federal Vision advertise their covenant doctrine as the covenant doctrine of Schilder and the liberated churches. All that they are doing, they themselves say, is developing the liberated doctrine of the covenant. Developing it in the teaching of justification by works. Developing it by teaching divine election in the sense of Ephesians 1 verse 4. God chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world. Teaching the doctrine of election in that sense of every baptized child, Esau as well as Jacob, which election, they say, can fail to save. Or as Douglas Wilson has put it, quote, devolve into reprobation, end quote. That is, election can become reprobation for one and the same individual. Out of that conditional covenant doctrine comes the teaching of an ineffectual death of Christ for all the baptized babies alike, and also the teaching of the possibility of the falling away of covenant saints who were once saved in Christ. And the critics of the federal vision, such as they are, know this. Indeed, publicly state this. At that high-powered conference at Knox Seminary, to which real critics of the federal vision were not invited, Carl Robbins, one of the purported critics of the federal vision, said this to the whole House. I quote, "I finally grasped that he, John Barrick, as spokesman for the federal vision, is simply restating the distinctive covenant theology of the liberated Reformed churches. Therefore, it must fairly be pointed out that Pastor Barrick cannot be charged with theological novelty, for his views were first propounded by Klaus Skilder in the 1940s, and before him, Calvin Seminary professor William W. Hines from the early 1900s. In fact, Pastor Barrick and the federal vision have simply and faithfully restated those covenant understandings." End of quote, and that is true. Except that in the interest of time, I ignore the fact that the history of the conditional covenant goes back further than Skilder and Hines. The truth is that the conditional covenant doctrine goes back to the 1800s to two Dutch preachers, Peters and Croyland, in the Netherlands, and before them to James Arminius in the late 1500s. The covenant doctrine of the federal vision is essentially that which the canons of Dort condemn in Head 2, Article 8, concerning the confirmation of the covenant with the elect by the death of Christ, and which the canons of Dort condemn in Head 2, Rejection of Errors 2, 3, and 4, where the canons reject the teaching that God makes the new covenant conditionally with elect and non-elect alike. The point I am making here is simply this, that the conditional covenant doctrine of the